Welcome to the Heart Rate Variability Podcast. Each week we talk about heart rate variability and how it can be used to improve your overall health and wellness. Please consider the information in this podcast for your informational use and not medical advice. Please see your medical provider to apply any of the strategies outlined in this episode. Heart Rate Variability Podcast is a production of Optimal LLC and Optimal HRV. Check us out at optimalhrv.com. Please enjoy the show. Welcome, friends, to the Heart Rate Variability Podcast. I am Matt, back here with Dave and Ina today. Looking forward to talking about Chapter 5 with HRV biofeedback and mindfulness. Now, we are lucky enough to have the world's expert on this topic on the podcast with that. And if you're just joining in for the first time, we are doing a series on our book, The Heartbeat of Business. So I would really encourage you, you'll see this episode that has an episode number on it. Go back to number 1. Do yourself a favor. This has been a great series. We've been getting a lot of great feedback on it. So go back to episode 1, catch up with us. It'll just make what we talk about today, even though it's a really exciting topic, make that much more sense. Plus, you'll get free chapters of our audiobook as you go through this as well. So for those of you that have taken this journey with us, thank you for doing so. And with that, really excited to jump into this. And we don't want to necessarily repeat what was provided in the chapter for you. So I wanted to just kind of focus our discussion today, as in the book, we talk about providing HRV biofeedback and mindfulness as a job resource. So remembering that that is something we're going to provide to offset the distress from work, but also to lead to engagement as well. And while HRV biofeedback and mindfulness probably won't address all the distress inherent to the modern workplace or provide full engagement for employee, it can be a big component of really doing that. So as we look at shifting the book, this is sort of the chapter where we talk about minimizing distress before this chapter, managing distress, the levels of burnout. This is where we really shift in how do we use the HRV science to really help set up a healthy workplace, to keep people resilient, and really help to build resiliency, wellness, engagement through our workforce. So again, make sure you go back and listen to the episode. We talk about healthy breathing. I know it's hard for me and Dave just to talk about healthy breathing and not talk about, if you really want to go in, I think we had 2 episodes, Dave, on healthy breathing back earlier in the podcast as well. So hours worth of material there. But I would like to talk and focus our time today on integrating this into the workplace. And I want to sometimes you say the workplace, the work day, but also providing this as a job resource to folks that they may practice in and outside the work environment. So with that really general preference, Ina, let me start with you since we got the expert on. Let's go straight to you on this. When you work with groups, organizations to implement all of the work you've done on HRV biofeedback and mindfulness, I just kind of wonder where you start with folks, especially if they're new to this concept. Well, maybe everybody's heard of mindfulness, hooking yourself up to a device, taking an RF assessment, all those things might be new to folks. So when you help folks start to think about implementing this in their group, in their workplace, what are some things that you like to include in that conversation?
Very good question, Matt. It's surprising how difficult it may be to fit in, a 3-minute reading, into your day. So I start out with encouraging people to think in very, very concrete terms. How is this going to fit into your day? People are often very tempted just to go, oh, yeah, sometime in the morning, or I'm sure I'll get it done sometime during the day. It's only 3 minutes, right? It's not And that oftentimes does not work. So I'll encourage people to think about, well, what time, during your day, what time during the morning is this going to be the first thing you do when you wake up? Is this going to be something you do when you first get into the office? Be as concrete as possible. And obviously things change and schedules need to be flexible. You can't put too much structure around this, but some structure, especially in the beginning, as you acquire a new habit, can go a very, very, very long way. And if we're talking about organizations and companies that are encouraging their employees to engage in this, it's really helpful for these organizations to provide a comfortable space. Oftentimes, people are, in those big rooms with cubicles. It's nice when somebody has their own office, but realistically, that doesn't always happen. So having some, a mindfulness room where people can go, maybe not for their 3-minute reading, that one may be happening at home or even at their desk. But if we're talking about integrating a mindfulness practice, it's really nice to have some space where people can go that's away from all the hustle and bustle and chaos of everyone else. So if the organization is really committed to providing this service to their employees, then having space and maybe even like sort of encouraging 15-minute mindfulness breaks once or twice throughout the day can go a very long way.
Awesome. Dave, any thoughts on this as you work more and more with organizations and groups?
Matt, actually, I was wondering if I could toss a question in there as well.
Absolutely.
Because this is something that I had come up once before in regards to doing the biofeedback and looking at the resonance frequency assessment and everything. So I actually recently just had a patient who had a very difficult time with the RF assessment, in that they said it was making them very anxious. They were getting to the point where it was difficult for them to complete even the assessment. And I'm sorry to spin it back in another way, but Matt, when you said the RF assessment, you made me think of this right away. What would you recommend for a patient like that, or is this something that happens often?
It happens more often than we might think. There is a fair number of people for whom this feels like a test or an evaluation, and just having that pacer in front of them will sometimes create a lot of anxiety for people. So yeah, it absolutely happens. And if it does, the first thing I'll recommend is for people to spend a little more time on mindfulness training. So maybe spending some time on, doing mindful breathing practice. And there is a meditation in the app, mindfulness of the breath. I would do it without the device, without measuring anything, but just learning how to pay attention to your breath without struggling with it, without letting go of the judgments and letting go of the temptation to rush. Just really learning how to attend to the breath the way it is. And once that starts feeling comfortable, then taking the resonance frequency assessment, I would do it one breathing rate at a time. There is a pause that's built in. So do your, start with 7 breaths a minute, pause for maybe a minute or two. I wouldn't necessarily recommend, dragging this out too long, but just taking a minute or two to take a breather from your breath practice. Just, put your mind somewhere else, then refocus on the breath. For 6.5, etc. But doing so with some mindfulness practice under your belt, once you've already learned how to disengage from the thoughts that come into your mind, and how to allow yourself not to struggle with the breath. So that's my primary recommendation. But also very much remember that, this is just for you. No one is going to have access to that data without your permission. You can retake that resonance frequency assessment if you want to. I don't recommend having people do this too many times, but if it feels like, you know what, that just did not feel comfortable and I'd rather take it another day when I feel a little more into it, that's fine. There is really no way to fail it. I think that's probably the most important message for people. There is no way to fail it. No one is going to judge you. No one's going to see it. And there is no bad number that you can get as a result, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's just a characteristic that you're going to learn about. It's really something that's already a part of you that the assessment is going to reveal. And there is no way to get, to make a bad choice there, right? It just is what it is. So the best thing you can do is give yourself permission to breathe, practice breathing without a struggle, practice perhaps breathing with a pacer without a struggle before going to the resonance frequency assessment. And once it starts feeling comfortable, then give yourself permission to go for it.
Well, thank you. That is very helpful. And yeah, just in doing the assessment as well as the training, it's not easy, even though it is breathing.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think it's important from, again, the organizational, and I'd love to hear, if you have any thoughts or ideas about this, like how does a group integrate this in? Because I think to me, one of the really important things is we built out this functionality in the Optimal HRV app was the onboarding process, because I'm one that wants to jump right into 25 minutes, get the assessment done, like go in. And I think it's really important to pay attention to. We just want you to practice. If you don't use a pacer, get comfortable with that, and really a gradual titration, so to speak, or dosage until you're really ready to do this. And hopefully that also would address some of the individual. But I kind of wanted to, if you think about an organization that might, be somebody tuning into this podcast and saying, okay, this science is really cool. We've got a lot of folks really struggling with burnout. Where would you where would the starting point be for a group, an organization who says, yeah, I want to bring all of Ina's science on board? Where do we start? What are some strategies that you've seen worked, as people may have not heard of resonance frequency breathing rates, or even biofeedback in a way that the HRV apps allow you to do?
I find that it's really helpful to have an educational meeting about this. If the organization really wants to propagate this to all or most of their employees, it's hard to just leave it up to people to figure this out on their own. I mean, yes, the resources are there, but everybody has limited time, limited bandwidth. So my suggestion is to have like a lunch and learn type situation where one person, perhaps the leader, learns, more about this, reads a bit, or, invites a speaker to come and talk about every one of these points. You can cover a lot in an hour. You can hit kind of the high level of most of these points and explain to people what's going on and what they're doing and why they're doing and how to do it, and set people up in a place where they can then take over and do this on their own. And perhaps even in a in smaller groups. I wouldn't necessarily do this in a huge group, but in smaller groups, you can actually have people, practice some breathing together, maybe even determine their resonance frequency of breathing together. Of course, everyone will have to have their own device, but that can work. In some groups, in some organizations, I would be careful with this. People need to feel fairly comfortable with another. Again, a smaller group is important, but that could be another way to set people up for success, is actually to start out doing some of these practices together. So when I go into organizations to do these kinds of trainings, that's exactly what I do. We start out with just an informational meeting, and then We have everybody together to start doing some of these practices together. First, becoming comfortable with the breath without a struggle, which is really important before getting to the resonance frequency assessment. Even if the resonance frequency assessment doesn't make you terribly anxious, it's really important to make sure you have some breath practice first. And that you're comfortable breathing slowly with a pacer before getting there. And doing that together in a group can be helpful because, well, you're all together, everyone's doing the same thing. It can actually oftentimes reduce judgment, and no one can see what you're doing either, right? So it can, it can be both comforting and stress relieving at once. So that could be a way to go.
Yeah, awesome. So one of the things that I would, like to introduce here, because it jumps ahead a few chapters, but I want to get especially leaders thinking in this regard, because it really sets up a lot of what we're going to talk about in the next a few chapters with job resources. And that's really the nature of a job resource, right? So what we're providing a benefit, a resource to help offset distress. That's where we've been so far in the book. We'll talk about engagement a little bit longer. If you're looking at the book, that's sort of in the bottom line of the job demands resources model. But I think it's really important to think about, how do we set up a resource? In other ways, you're providing this, but I think you get benefit from saying, hey, we're going to give you a free membership to this app, and here's an HRV reader. That's sort of one level. And I don't think that's a bad thing. My healthcare, I got all kinds of apps I can get free resources for. It's not a bad thing. I don't use any of them, but it's still not a bad thing. There's another message that we can send. And I think in a time, especially if you're really have an organization, a field struggling with burnout, it's really setting people up for success in a different way. I'll use the analogy of, a lot of folks have like an employee assistance program where they have free access to therapy. Now that's great, but if you're like, okay, I know we burnt you out at work, but please take your personal time to schedule, find childcare, and go across town to therapy and back to recover from your burnout, I kind of want to give you a single finger response to that, but that's been like the historical approach. So I love what you said, and Dave, I'd love to get you any thoughts you have on this as well, is trying to find a space, because think about the difference in messaging. Here's an app, it's going to make you healthier, please use it, right? And we're going to track you to make sure you use it. Versus, hey, we really want to support you in practicing this for 15, 20 minutes a day. We have a room or an area set aside as a quiet space, maybe a comfortable chair, a beanbag, whatever it might be. And we are going to allow you during your work day to utilize this space. In other words, we want to pay you to practice mindfulness and biofeedback, because if you read the chapter, what you know as a leader, it's going to improve performance. It's going to improve emotional regulation, stress management, probably have people happier with each other throughout the workday. So that really, when we think about resources, we think about investments. And the real challenge of that is, how do we set people up to really utilize those? Because it feels good to say, hey, we're going to give you free therapy. We're going to give you access to this app. But we also need to take it a step further and really set people up to succeed as well. So Dave, I want to bring you in here. Any other additional sort of thoughts on how folks might implement this in a way to really set folks up for success, including kind of being, I know you and your organization kind of being a role model for this as well.
So you guys have brought up some excellent points already. With the providing a space, a safe space, providing a team type environment for encouragement, all of those things are absolutely huge. And Matt, I love that point that you brought up there too, that we can't expect an employee to do something outside of work time that is only going to put more stress on that employee, right? It's not doing them a favor when that is the case. So those are such great points. And and great things to highlight. But yes, it is, it is not only providing the tool like the reader and access to the actual device or actual app. And granted, it doesn't have to be that if you have 100 employees, you have to purchase 100 readers. Right? You can have a community reader. In my office, I have a community reader in my waiting room. That's we don't have to look at it that way. And then, it's a bit of a shift in mindset for a manager, for an employer as well, because if I look at it and I have Matt and Ina as employees and I'm paying them to do their job for 8 hours each day, and, one of those hours can be a lunch break, right? Then for me, well, if they take 20 minutes to go do something personal, well, that's eating out of my pocket, right? That's taking food off my kid's plate. Yeah. But as we prove, as we talk about so much throughout this book, right, allowing an employee to do something like that brings them back recharged, right? It makes them a better employee. So when they come back to work thereafter, they're going to be more productive.
Yeah.
Rather than sitting there burnt out, pissed off, whatever, they are coming back to work in a much more positive light, and much more engaged, and they're going to put out much better quality work in a shorter amount of time. So these are all great benefits. So these are reasons why an employer might want to change that mindset. But then as well, when we look at okay, yes, we gave them the resources. Now let's provide that education. And maybe that is bringing in somebody like Ina to come and talk, or or lunch and learn with a professional in the area. I love that idea, but continual support and feedback, and just that welcoming environment, that this is normal. And we see leaders already doing things like this, like Google, for example, already supplies their employees space to step away for a moment, right? Space to clear their heads. I think they even have nap pods. Is that correct?
Yeah, I believe they do.
Yeah. Which sounds crazy too, right? I'm going to let my employees take a nap. But yes, all things like that are just excellent to do for our employees in any way that we can support them. And the lead by example, I think, is probably one of the most important things. Yeah. If the leaders are doing it, if the bosses are doing it, then the employers will follow. And it's not taboo. It's not weird. It is okay to do. This is acceptable to do because my manager is doing it, because the owner of the company is doing it. That makes it okay. That makes it very acceptable and motivating for employees to follow.
Absolutely. And I always like to challenge leaders too, because Dave, you bring up a great point about, well, that 20 minutes or 15 minutes is 15 minutes they're not working. However, Google does it, Facebook does it. Like the companies we hold up really as models of what kind of we all would love to be. If you have a small business, you'd love to be the next Google, right? You would love to emulate those best places to work. And so this is a small way to do that, to show you care about the wellness of your employees, to really live sort of this model that just seems out of reach, I think, for a lot of people. Well, here's a real affordable way for you to integrate some of this. And as we'll talk about, I think I can lay this out a little bit now, because it's going to be weeks from now when we get to the chapter, is showing that you care about your employees. We know that's the #1 predictor of engagement on that bottom line. So what's a way to show that is to provide resources and give people time to utilize those resources. So that's where I really challenge folks is, do you want to be the next Google? Well, start acting like Google, start acting like Facebook. And I know you don't probably have in your budget to hire a world-class chef to cook for everybody, but you probably do have it to bring this in too. So that's my challenge to leaders of any size company. And if you're working from home, encourage people to do that as a break during the workday. Take a half-hour lunch, do a 20-minute biofeedback practice, integrating those things into the workday. I gotta ask you, because I'm very interested in this, because you came up with the idea of flair, which I have really adapted into my own way of talking about mindfulness. And I'm always fascinated. I don't hear a ton of people talk about it this way, so it means I'm probably kind of wrong with it. But I always like to think about mindfulness as a state and a trait. Everybody talks about mindfulness as a state. In other words, if we're breathing at our RF breathing rate, if we're doing one of the guided meditations, paying attention to our heart rate, other biofeedback we're getting, we enter a mindful state, which has a huge amount of research to say this is good. I really see one of the goals is we want to be mindful. Like we want to, especially in the face of stress, hardship, challenges, we want to bring a sense of mindfulness into those arenas. And I just kind of want to, because I think for business people, the flair model would in many ways how you want people to interact with customers, how you want folks to interact during meetings with coworkers and other folks within the work environment. And it's a mad question, I know, but think about the translation of the work you've done with flair as a part of mindfulness practice into maybe sort of norms within an organizational culture.
I think you are completely on point, Matt, and you make an excellent point about transitioning from mindfulness being a state that you get into every once in a while to it becoming more of a trait. And ultimately, that is the point. No, we probably won't be mindful 24/7. That's an unrealistic, but also an unnecessary goal. But what is realistic and very helpful is just to develop a more mindful approach in life in general, which is what mindfulness practice tends to do when we practice on a regular basis, just like heart variability practice. Both of these practices help us regulate our activation better. So we end up being able to respond in more thoughtful, more mindful ways to whatever comes our way on a regular basis. And mindfulness practice, changes the way our brains respond, right? So it sets us up for a greater likelihood of a mindful response. Heart variability practice changes the way the nervous system and, the peripheral nervous system and the brain respond. Again, setting us up for a more thoughtful, more helpful, more resilient response to challenges. And something like flair takes both mindfulness and biofeedback practice and integrates it into our everyday decision making, into our everyday response to stress. And it does become much more automatic with time. This is very much something I'm finding with my clients. Initially, in order to practice flair, they have to remember, they have to set reminders for themselves. They often don't remember because that's not the first thing that comes to mind. But once they've used it a couple of times in low-level stress situations, and they feel like, oh, okay, I'm kind of getting how to use it and it's being helpful, then I might remember about it just a little bit more frequently. And every time I remember it, every time I practice it, that skill becomes a little bit more ingrained in the brain, and it kind of builds on itself. And people are able to use flair as a response to more and more challenging situations. And eventually, the brain just kind of starts going there rather than the habitual automatic response of whatever it may be, avoid, get away from it, or blow up, or make a quick decision, something that's not very helpful. Instead, the brain starts going more towards flair, and kind of going through the flair steps, which is initially just feel like what's happening right now. It's just kind of what lets you know that there is something going on. Labeling, giving a name to that experience. here is discomfort, here's unhelpful thinking, here is worry, here's fear, right? And that changes the way your brain responds to that stressful situation. So rather than activating the fight or flight response very heavily, right, the fight or flight response is more moderated, and the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that's responsible for decision making, is now more active and putting on the brakes to that fight or flight activation. So this actually helps your brain activate the most helpful parts of itself, right? Which then moves you into the A, which is allow, and that's it's okay to feel this way. Then we're no longer fighting with something that's not under our control, right? We can't control how we think and feel in the moment, but we do try, right? We try this all the time as human beings. We try not to feel or think certain things all the time, and that wastes resources. That's quite literally, deprives us of blood sugar, deprives us of the resources and the fuel that we need in order to figure out how to respond to the stressful situation. So when we're no longer wasting those resources, when we just allow the feelings to be as they are, we now have all those resources to use for figuring out how to respond, which happens to be the next step in FLAIR, the R, which is respond. And that is a choice. Are you making a choice? How am I going to respond to this? What's in my best interest here? Biofeedback often becomes a part of that. We can use the biofeedback skills to re-regulate ourselves. That can be a nice way to, pay attention to the breath, or get into the resonance frequency breathing, so that the body and the mind can get out of that overwhelmed and unable to think state and into one where they can figure out the next steps. The respond step is needs to be much more flexible, because it's going to depend on what the situation is. But there are absolutely certain skills as part of the response that can always be there, such as your biofeedback skills, your heart variability practice skills, your breathing skills, some of the mindfulness skills. They can always be there to help you then decide how to go forward. And then the final step in FLAIR, which is E for expand awareness, that's just taking a step back away from this difficult problem is all I can see, and it's taking up all of my awareness, and I cannot, see my way past it. Instead, making that problem be just a part of your awareness. There's lots of things going on. And yes, there is this problem that's a part of it, but it's just a part of it. It's not one big problem everywhere, right? So it helps us again, reduce the overwhelm, and helps us figure out how to move forward.
Awesome.
So these steps become kind of a part of how we respond to challenges with a little bit of practice. And it really does not take all that much. For most of my clients, after a couple of months, this becomes much more automatic. They don't have to, really think about it all that much. It just becomes a part of it.
Yeah, and I think that's what I've learned from my now 15 years of mindfulness practice, is that you get to that awareness, and then I always think about being able to say, okay, I can label this emotional experience, which gives us a level of control over it. So I really think that is so key. And I just want to put in a plug too for leaders. If you've ever worked for a leader that's totally dysregulated, you're dysregulated. The team's dysregulated. I've never seen an example where that's not true. You will see that dysregulation is incredibly contagious. So for leaders, I always almost like to think, and this gets a little bit, I think, probably controversial for some folks, but we talk about in psychology, a healthy parent or regulated parent creates what we call secure base. In other words, it's this person of safety in which the child can go then explore the world. And I believe that while a leader doesn't take the role of the parent by any stretch of the imagination, that there is some of this natural human instinct. Whereas if we can create a psychological safe relationship, and we'll talk about trust and safety in future chapters, it allows me to take risk. It allows me, innovation is kind of taking a risk against the status quo. It allows me to bring my best self to work, because I don't have to worry about the crazy leader dysregulating, yelling at me for the thing they asked me to do yesterday. So I just really think if we're going to create healthy work environments, especially in this time where our cups are almost already all full, which makes flair that much more difficult, this practice can really help us get back into that emotional regulation and wellness. So, Dave, any other thoughts on this? I think it's been a great discussion furthering what we've covered in the chapter.
I was muted. No, I mean that is just unbelievable. Ina's explanation there. So I feel honored to have listened to that live as it was being said. But equally, Matt, like you, I've been practicing mindfulness meditation for quite some time, and it is when you get to that experience of, oh my gosh, things are changing in an unexplainable way, and I can very much remember when I had a shift happen for me, and you realize that the background noise has kind of gone away.
Yeah.
That you're able to focus so much better, that you're not thinking 100 different thoughts, but rather you're present with just this one. You're present with just the person in front of you. That's a huge place to be able to arrive at. And Ina, thank you also for pointing out that doesn't have to be a goal for 100% of the time, and that is an unnecessary goal. I love that you said that, because I think a lot of us get stuck in that. We have to be fully present all the time, or we're not reaching that highest level of ourselves. That may be unrealistic.
Exhausting.
Yes, very exhausting.
And technically speaking, we just need some time to, plan things for the future, which is, I guess, technically not mindfulness, but we got to be there sometime. So
absolutely.
Yeah,
I'm a great daydreamer.
Yeah. Which we don't want to lose. I mean, the research will also tell us that just to give yourself time to wonder at times too. I mean, most great insight happens when we're not thinking about the great insight, right? We're on vacation, we're in the shower, where we're doing something else, and it just kind of pops in. So that back and forth, I think is so important. I also want to throw out there, Dave, too. Don't think about, the interesting thing I found with my own mindfulness practice, much kind of like starting a physical workout routine, is you do it, if you're running, if you want to be a long distance runner, obviously, if you do that for 5 years, you will build resiliency, strength to run longer and longer and longer, and maybe faster if that's your goal. But the big insights and the big jumps are right when you start a practice. I remember mine, I was getting, I hate being late for meetings, and I was starting to freak out that I was going to be 5 minutes late for a meeting, where I get all sweaty and I start to speed in my car. Nothing good for society or the people I'm going to meet with. And I accidentally took a breath. I didn't even mean to. And all of a sudden that calm from my new practice entered my body. I'm like, oh, this is what it's about. And I was like, okay, 5 minutes late to a meeting, this meeting never starts on time anyway. I then had this script in my head, which didn't lead me to going 80 miles an hour through a residential neighborhood that would make my drive longer because I wasn't following Google Maps. So, it's just that piece of, while you hear about, probably, I'm sure the three of us have been practicing for over a decade on some of this stuff. Yeah, long term, it is worth the journey and every minute I put into it. But I don't think you have to have 5 or 10 years until you realize some of the benefits. You're going to be sore after the first one, just like if you got new physical activity, and not sore mentally, but it'll be tiring. Your mind will wander, all this stuff, but you will start to get some of the biggest insights I've gotten were right in those initial stages as well. So, and again, 15 years later, I'm a different person today, in ways my wife likes. I don't throw appliances nearly as much. It's the one trigger I have for some reason. Not people, appliances. I beat up a chainsaw once. That was my most violent my wife has ever seen me, is chainsaw wouldn't start. I started throwing it around. I didn't know she was watching me, basically. And she's like, yeah. So she still gives me, I was like, have I beat up any appliances since? She's like, no, you've been pretty good. So
The idea of you fighting with a chainsaw.
I know.
Thanks
I was like, the chainsaw
for
should
that.
start, and it wasn't. And I thought throwing it on the ground multiple times would help it start. Guess what? Didn't help. But yeah.
In your defense, chainsaws are quite finicky.
They are finicky, and you got to mix the oil and the gas, and who has time for that? And so it was really the chainsaw's fault. It wasn't Matt's at all. So with that really embarrassing and fun story, Ina, any other thoughts? Dave, you can throw anything in here on the way out. I think this was a great discussion to supplement the chapter.
No, this was excellent. Thank you, Matt.
Yeah, I would just say, the theme of pretty much everything we talk about is do yourself a favor and practice.
Yes.
All of this helps, but only if you practice.
Yep. And as you remember this chapter, just think if flair started to be a characteristic of your culture, a characteristic of your meetings, a characteristic of how you treat each other, because again, it's that cognitive engagement, but that's so dependent on our emotional regulation and our social health, that Daniel Goleman, that social emotional intelligence, all of which we're building with heart rate variability, especially when we start to talk about something that I've seen my HRV, just the RF breathing practice, game changer for me. And that's somebody who'd been practicing mindfulness for over a decade. Boy, that's where I saw my numbers really spike. So to me, one of the most important chapters as we shift into tracking to really improving. And we'll continue this theme going forward, looking with other practices that are really going to support a healthy HRV. But like I said, I can do a lot of things, but RF breathing rate just been a game changer for me personally as well. So with that said, Ina, Dave, thank you so much. Thank you for listening to us. Please stay tuned for next week. We'll hit the next chapter. And again, I want to just thank everybody for taking this journey with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.